On this episode, part 2 of our discussion with Dr. Clifford and his wife Joyce Penner as we discuss their book, The Gift of Sex, A Guide to Sexual Fulfillment.
Welcome to the Healing Place Marriage and Family Podcast, where families are equipped to reflect God's redeeming love. And now, here are your hosts, Michael Compagna and Jared Lambert.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Healing Place Marriage and Family Podcast. This is Michael Compagna, your co-host. Joining me, as always, is Jared Lambert. Jared, we have a repeat guest on this week.
Yes, we do, Michael. Joining us again are Drs. Clifford and Joyce Penner, author of the book that we'll be talking about today, The Gift of Sex. Last episode, we talked about getting your sex life off to a great start, and appreciate them taking time to joining us again for this episode, talking about the gift of sex.
All right. So, doctors, thank you again for being here.
Thank you for having us. We enjoy this.
Great. Well, why don't you give us a little bit of background? This is an unusual field to become an expert in.
Yes.
How did this happen for you?
It's definitely been a calling, not something we intended to do, but we really believe what we prepared for, even though it wasn't this, that God used it for this purpose, because our preparation fits for it perfectly, our education.
Since we both grew up in homes that didn't talk about this, as I mentioned, we were both raised in Mennonite homes, and then really didn't learn about this until right before we got married. Then went on and got our education. Joyce was a university professor, and I'm a clinical psychologist in practice, and through a set of circumstances we were asked to teach some women about sexuality, and so we started studying it. And when we did a 10-week course on that, we got such a positive response that we started teaching it, and then we got ourselves educated on the subject.
It's like we were always playing catch up for where our life was going, and so after teaching that class, then we got asked to speak at different conferences, and it got picked up by the LA Times religion section and went on the National Wire Service, and it was all about the sex revolution in the church, which was basically Cliff and Joyce Penner. So we were the pioneers in bringing this information into the church community.
And so then we were asked by Word Books to write our first book, which came out in 1981. That's The Gift of Sex, the book we're talking about right now. And we revised it since then. But that's been around now for 40 years.
And that's a basic sex manual for married couples. It's a very helpful one for couples to read out loud together, just to get them talking, and it's not so much to read through it as to read a part of it and then discuss it and get their communication and clarify differences and be able to express, that isn't how it is for me, how is it for you? It helps not only give information, but also helps the process of growth sexually in a married relationship.
Most people don't grow up being comfortable talking about this subject. So what we find is that if a couple would be willing to read a book like The Gift of Sex out loud together, they hear themselves say the words, and the process of reading it, not each one going into their own corner and reading it quietly.
Which sometimes happens even when we have assigned reading it out loud together, because it's just too uncomfortable. It's not something they're used to.
But rather reading it out loud together and then dealing with it. We also often kiddingly say, people will say, "Oh, we've got your book in our nightside stand," and we say, "Well, it doesn't work by osmosis. You actually have to read it."
Get it out of the nightside stand.
Yeah. Well, like you said, the book came out in 1981, and since then you guys have made a lot of revisions. Let's talk about what is the message that has been consistent since 81.
Yes, and right from the beginning, realizing that sex is good and of God, that we were designed as sexual people, created in God's image before sin, and that the sexual relationship between a husband and wife was God's design and guideline already in Genesis chapter 2 before sin entered the world. So it's part of his perfect design for us, not part of our sinful nature.
Second thing is that our curiosity about sexuality and our interest in it is just as natural as can be. Kids get curious about this, about their bodies, about their responses from very early on. Even little toddlers are interested and curious.
And they find, when they touch themselves, it feels good. And we as parents, it's very important to give the message that this is special and this is a special part, and it's special because God made it that way rather than that it's bad. And then not only are we curious, but our bodies are responsive, and that's how they were made.
A man gets an erection every 80 to 90 minutes while he sleeps, and a woman gets aroused every 80 to 90 minutes while she sleeps.
And these responses start. A little boy has his first erection within 5 to 10 minutes of birth, and a little girl lubricates vaginally within the first 24 hours. And we always say we as women are always a little bit slower, but we eventually do get there.
So the first thing is sex is good and of God. A second thing is that our curiosity is natural. A third thing is that our responsiveness is innate. That's how we're all made.
There are things that might interfere with that, physical, emotional, and experiential, but that's how we were designed in terms of God's perfect design.
Then the fourth thing is that all of us are responsible for what we do with those responses. So God gave us the responses, and then he gave us the responsibility for how we act in regard to those responses. And that can either be violating or sinful or destructive or selfish, or it can be in the context that God has ordained. But we get to make those choices.
And have to. We are the ones who do make those choices.
Absolutely.
And then, yes, and that these choices.
Like the New Testament emphasizes, we're now dual natured. So sometimes we're led by the Spirit, sometimes we're led by the flesh. So when these natural God-given responses come up, we have the decision to either let those lead us by the Spirit or lead us to the flesh. And the goal of every mature believer is to be led and walk in the Spirit, more and more, and less being led and walk in the flesh.
And yet we have to be careful about the interpretation of that, because sometimes that's heard as the flesh is bad. And
that our responsiveness is bad, rather than that the decisions we make in response to our responsiveness is what's the moral choice that we have to make.
Right.
So we want to make sure that isn't heard as, therefore, our desires are bad, our desires are good and of God, but we have to make the choice, and we have the strength because of God in us and the Holy Spirit in us, and he's given us his power to control that.
Right. Good point.
And then when we make those choices, those decisions should be based on the biblical teaching and the biblical standards. And the main biblical teaching for marriage, consistent throughout the New Testament, is that the sexual relationship between a husband and wife is to be one of mutuality.
Let's explain that. In the Old Testament, if you go back to the Ten Commandments, for example, the woman was thought of as part of the man's net worth. When in the commandment it says, you shall not covet your neighbor's ox, nor his ass, nor his maidservant, nor his manservant, nor his wife. It's just listing the man's assets. In the New Testament, we have a new message. Galatians 3:28 says, therefore, now because of Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, so the racial barriers have been broken down. There is neither slave nor free, so the social barriers have been broken down. There is neither male nor female, so the gender barriers have been broken down, because we are now all one in Christ. And so mutuality is the primary message that we get in the New Testament about the sexual relationship between a husband and wife.
And basically the way we say that practically, the concept is good, but what does that mean practically? And the way we interpret that is it's got to be as good for one as it is for the other if it's going to be good for both of them for a lifetime. It can't be one-sided.
One other thing I would add there have been those in the church community who have emphasized that it's the woman's duty to provide the man with sex so that he stays home and doesn't wander. That is a total distortion of what the New Testament teaches about the sexual relationship between a husband and wife.
We are to give ourselves to each other, but that's not just one-sided. That's totally mutual. That 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 3, I believe it is, talks about the husband giving himself to his wife and the wife giving herself to her husband.
Absolutely. I mean, men are not dogs. We don't.
Exactly.
The wife is not the keeper of the leash. We have full responsibility over the decisions that we make
Yes.
regarding our sexuality. So that's an excellent point to make. Since sex is a gift from the Lord, and since it is intended to be enjoyed, that we're not just making babies, but we are building a relationship with one another, what are those biblical expectations? I know we've already touched on some. What are the biblical expectations for sex in marriage?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, if we just go with the specific passage in Genesis 2:24, it talks about leaving mother and father, becoming one. So one of the expectations is unity. That is, it is becoming one flesh.
That really is what we're talking about when we talk about intimacy. It's bringing your worlds together and losing yourselves with each other in a different way than is true in any other experience or relationship.
Then sometimes it is about making babies, but these days that's, by national standards, that's 2.5 times. And we hope that our sexual life is more active than that over a lifetime. So it is making babies, but then a very significant part of it is about pleasure. And this is one of the places where sometimes people get a little bit nervous, like, well, isn't that fleshly pleasure? And yet when you look at it, there's a whole book in the Bible, the Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs, however you name it, that is only about the sexual pleasure between a man and a woman. It is an erotic poem that has lots of symbolism, but it's really about the sexual experience between the husband and wife.
And that's how God designed our bodies. And when we freely enjoy our bodies and give our bodies to each other, as the New Testament teaches, there will be pleasure, and that is to be delighted in and enjoyed, but never at the expense of the other one. It's not to be selfish pleasure, but delightful, together pleasure.
So obviously, the ideal is that this would be a lifetime of fulfillment with your spouse, but obviously there's a lot of difficulty here for a lot of couples. You guys counsel with people constantly, all the time.
Right.
What are some of the common issues and questions that couples bring to you, to your offices, about their sex life?
Well, first, just the common question that we get in email, not for therapy so much, but in emails and calls and stuff like that, is what is okay for a husband and wife to do? What activities, sexual activities, are okay in marriage? And since the Bible doesn't give real, it's very clear about where sex should happen, that happens,
happen in marriage,
and that it is between a husband and wife, but it doesn't say a husband and wife can do this, they can't do that. And so we have to go to other biblical principles. So we have kind of created some guiding principles that we believe come out of Scripture.
The first of those is that it needs to be loving between you. So when somebody's saying, is it okay to do this or that, it needs to be a loving act rather than a self-serving act. And that connects it with being mutual. as we said earlier, it has to be as good for one as it is for the other.
And usually when a spouse calls us or emails us, it's because one of them, the other spouse, wants to do something that they're not comfortable with.
And digressing for just a moment here, very often these days, that's because the man has seen it on porn and now wants to experience that with his wife. So that's why we say it has to be mutually fulfilling and not violating. It has to build the oneness. It has to bring them closer to each other in the experience, not where one person feels pressured and the other person feels
used
or used,
yeah,
and the other person feels frustrated or whatever it may be.
Right. And an example that we would say would not be okay because of that principle that it has to bring intimacy or oneness is couples watching pornography together, because the secular research has shown that when couples watch pornography together, yes, they have more exciting sex immediately, but over time they lose their ability to respond to each other. So it's about responding to what they're seeing and acting it out with each other, but it's not about intimacy with each other.
So we want other guiding principle would be not only that it connect us and be mutual and not violating, but also doesn't disconnect us in our relationship with God. Very much a restoring of the openness and vulnerability that was there in the Garden of Eden, where, as we all know, once sin took place, it created a barrier between the man and the woman, and it created a barrier between the humans and God.
And that's where we believe our sexuality and spirituality should grow together, as we are freed through Christ's death for us to have an open relationship with Him, with God through Jesus, and an open relationship in our marriage. We can be free and open to delight and enjoy each other.
Now, that's just one question. I'm going to quickly list what the most common issues are
that bring
people to come to therapy. For women, it's lack of desire, lack of orgasm,
and pain,
and the issue of feeling physical pain. For men, it can be lack of desire also, even that though may be surprising. A lot of men come for that reason. Difficulty with premature ejaculation or difficulty with erectile dysfunction. Those six would be the most common ones. And then the issue of sexual addiction, which is about a major part of people who come to us for therapy. That is, people who are hooked on porn.
Right, and something that we always ask when people come to us for premarital counseling as well as for marital counseling, where, we ask each spouse individually. Where is porn in your life?
Yeah, I want to touch on something you said earlier when you rolled out the idea of couples watching pornography together. You in your book, The Gift of Sex, don't you guys kind of walk couples through exploration exercise, which is a healthy and a good substitute for engaging in pornography together? Instead of engaging in pornography together, your book provides a good guide to help couples explore one another, and that is, glorifying the God, that builds one another up. It builds intimacy. So that's a healthy substitute for
clearly
engaging in pornography together.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because we do teach about that very clearly in The Gift of Sex.
Yeah, like I said, that's a much healthier alternative to you're just letting in, you're just opening the door for the enemy. Comparison, unhealthy fantasies. Our passion, our emotions, supposed to be reserved for our wife and our husband and wife together. And like I said, I think the exercise of exploration you guys have in your book is absolutely a a better alternative.
Yes,
Sure,
it builds the intimacy where it's supposed to be, and we really encourage couples, even in those experiences, to thank God for their feelings and invite God into that experience so their sexuality and spirituality grow together.
I mean, the whole point of exclusivity is you can't let anyone else in.
Right.
And inviting outside sources into your relationship kind of defeats the purpose.
Absolutely. We have one little a bit of, I don't know what you'd call it, practical help for couples, that we encourage that they focus on the enjoyment of each other's bodies rather than, again, on producing the results or the response.
Being goal-oriented toward getting to the orgasm part of the experience rather than just being into it for the pleasure of it.
And the response is likely to happen when we totally enjoy each other. But we give some little helpful things, tips, I guess you'd call it, that couples can use. And one is that they learn to touch each other, enjoy each other in a way that's delightful for both the person who's doing the touching or pleasuring and the person who's receiving. That, again, each of us is free to enjoy the other one and give our body to the other one, but never to take advantage of the other one, and that each of us feel free to say if something isn't working for us or isn't positive, so that we never endure negative, but that there's some tools we can use. For example, touching in circles, stroking in circles rather than straight lines is usually more pleasurable for both.
But especially for the woman.
And it helps slow down and not be so goal-oriented. So
And then another one is if the man can focus on, and we talked about this in terms of going slowly, but if the man can keep his pace behind that of the woman so that he's not always rushing ahead and she's always trying to catch up.
The way we were explaining this to one couple, and they used to ride their bikes together, and she said, I know exactly what you mean, because when we ride our bikes together, if his front wheel stays just a couple inches behind mine, then I keep up and we just ride so well together. But the minute his front wheel gets ahead of mine, I get farther and farther behind. And that's such a good visual picture of what works sexually. When the man can keep both his intensity and the activity behind her and let her lead with her body, it just works so much better and feels so much better for both.
And then the last thing that we recommend in terms of keeping the passion alive is daily passionate kissing that is not designed to lead to sex. And let's explain what we mean here. So many times couples have enjoyed kissing passionately before they got married, and it turned them on and they could hardly contain themselves and all that stuff. And then they get married, and then
now they can do the real thing, so they stop everything that felt so good before and think it should feel good, and then all of a sudden it doesn't feel so good. We say just go back and make out like you did before when you couldn't do it all.
And then the other thing is that kissing can also be a symbol or a signal. Like, let's say the husband comes home and the wife is preparing dinner in the traditional roles here, and the man comes up and wants to have a kissing experience with his wife, and she says,
in her mind,
she says, let's see, do I want to have sex tonight or not? I'm not sure. I better not lead him on. And so she gives the cheek rather than the lips. And 10 years down the road, they're hardly kissing at all.
And then they're not having much sex either. So what we encourage is daily passionate kissing and feeling free to kiss without that being an indicator that the other person or both of you want sex that night, that day. That you can kiss passionately just for the joy of kissing and the intimacy of that and keeping passion alive in your relationship.
Well, it sounds like we have our first homework assignment for our married couples.
That's right. Start tonight.
Wow. Well, doctors, we certainly do appreciate you being here. I know we talked about this last week. Could you once again give our listeners your contact information for your website if they want to check out any of your books or any of the other resources that you have available.
Yeah, that is passionatecommitment.com. And on there, you'll have a lot of frequently asked questions and our response to that. All of our books, besides Gift of Sex and Getting Your Sex Life Off to a Great Start, are on there. And if you need to be in contact with us.
To contact us. And when you contact us, often those will eventually get to me, and I screen or answer those questions, and then
we respond to everybody that emails us. We may not get back the same day, but we
eventually
get back to everybody that sends us something. So feel free to do that. passionatecommitment.com.
And also, if you do call us through that, our telephone numbers, when you go to our website, our telephone number is there as well. Make sure you leave a contact number for us to call back, because if we don't respond, it's because somebody left us a message and we couldn't get a caller ID and we couldn't respond to your question. So be sure to leave that information.
Well, so Dr. Cliff and Dr. Joyce, I appreciate you guys taking time to joining us today. Like I said, I've had y'all booked for almost 6-7 years now, and it was great to be able to speak to y'all and hear y'all hearts. So we appreciate you guys coming and sharing with our listeners, and I hope you guys are open to possibly coming back and joining us and maybe zooming in on some of these topics that we talked about today.
We'd love to do that. Yes, very much.
Okay. Well, folks, thanks so much for listening. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and share this podcast with everyone you know, particularly if they're married, and even if they're not, so they can know what to expect. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us for today's podcast. For more information about Healing Place Church, visit us at healingplacechurch.org. For more podcast episodes, subscribe to the Healing Place Marriage and Family Podcast on iTunes or the podcast server for your device.